In the shadowed corners of the plantation, where whispers of power and subjugation intertwined, the white mistresses held a complex reign. Cloaked in the authority second only to the plantation owner, they oversaw the toil of the enslaved, wielding their influence with a heavy hand. Yet, beneath this facade of control, their lives were marred by a bizarre intimacy that blurred lines of morality and desire. The sun bore down mercilessly upon the fields where the mistresses would leave the enslaved women standing, punished for the slightest infractions. It was a life stripped of humanity, a truth laid bare in the harrowing accounts of Harriet Jacobs, whose words paint a portrait of a world steeped in licentiousness and dread. From a tender age, the slave girls were schooled in fear, their innocence shattered by the lewd commands of their masters. Gifts and promises were the currency of corruption, and when these failed, the whip and the pangs of hunger forced them into compliance. Behind closed doors, the mistresses grappled with their own chains of dissatisfaction. They too were ensnared in a web of obedience, their smiles a mask hiding the anguish of their husbands' infidelities. Loneliness gnawed at their hearts, driving them to seek solace in the exploitation of those under their sway, fulfilling their suppressed desires through the very souls they oppressed. Marriages, often sealed in the bloom of youth, wilted into solitude as the years passed. The mistresses' affairs with the enslaved were whispers in the wind, far less frequent than their husbands' transgressions, yet they occurred in the quiet moments of longing and despair. Contraception, a guarded secret of the time, was a testament to the forbidden fruits of these unions. The mistresses, trapped in a societal cage of virtue and piety, found themselves wrestling with the same carnal yearnings that led their husbands astray. The exploitation of the enslaved was a cruel game of power, a means to quench the mistresses' thirst for dominance in a world where they were otherwise powerless. Intimacy became a twisted form of recompense for their personal failings, a dark reflection of the oppression that bound them all. In this tangled hierarchy of power and subjugation, the mistresses could compel the enslaved to their will, a grim reality spoken of by Captain Richard Hinton and Ichoed in the experiences shared by Jacobs. They knew the weight of their authority, and in its shadow they sought to exert their will, choosing the most vulnerable as their pawns. Tasked with upholding the Christian virtues of the household, the mistresses' intimate lives were scrutinized and regulated, their transgressions met with harsher judgment than those of their male counterparts. Yet, beneath the veneer of chastity, the plantations were rife with contradictions, a stark contrast to the purity ascribed to the white women of high society. To confront the abominations of slavery is to witness the depths of human depravity, where the sanctity of the soul is bartered and the narrative of white women's chastity is wielded as a weapon of supremacy. It was within this twisted moral landscape that the mistresses navigated their desires, their frustrations, and their humiliations, sometimes bearing the secret children of forbidden love. In the end, the legacy of the plantation mistresses is a tapestry of sorrow and complexity, woven from the threads of power, desire, and the unyielding bonds of an unjust world. In the dim recesses of history, a girl's life unfolded within the walls of her father's house. There she was held captive, her existence a fragile thread woven into the fabric of a society that thrived on cruelty and exploitation. Her journey began with the birth of her child, a tender, fragile thing that should have been a beacon of hope. But this girl, this mother, was denied the simple joy of nursing her own flesh and blood. The child was snatched from her arms, a cruel separation that echoed through the corridors of time. Stripped of her rank, she became a shadow, a mere whisper of the person she once was. Her child, too, suffered a fate as bitter as the taste of tears. Sold into slavery, the innocent babe was thrust into a world where chains clanked and hearts bled. Why did this happen? To avoid scandal, they said. Infanticide loomed as a dark spectre, threatening to claim the lives of these defenseless children. For if they survived, they would become slaves, the property of others, their futures etched in chains. The planters' wives, those virtuous and honest girls, were meant to direct their love toward their husbands. But frustration simmered beneath their genteel exteriors. They, too, were a certain type of property, owned by husbands who wielded power like a whip. These masters exploited their wives just as they did their slaves, and the flames of justifiable anger flickered in the shadows. Freedom was a distant dream, its edges blurred by the harsh reality of their existence. When they traveled, it was with a male escort, a silent witness to their constrained lives. Southern country slave codes etched their oppression into the very fabric of the colonies. Female mastery, inscribed in ink and blood, became law. In 1701, South Carolina decreed that slaves castrated for fleeing their masters would face further mutilation for repeat escapes. Another law, born in 1740, held owners accountable for providing sufficient clothing and food to those enslaved under their charge. George's laws threatened fines for masters and mistresses who hired out slaves without approved tickets. Female slave ownership existed, acknowledged in the quiet corners of history. As male heads of households succumbed to the instability of colonial life, women stepped into the void. They managed plantations, bought, sold, and bequeathed slaves. Their financial status elevated them, granting access to public roles within their communities. Yet, within this repressive patriarchy, they clung to precarious privilege. Racist hierarchies were their currency, and they wielded it like a double-edged sword. Some mistresses resisted their husbands' control, while others thrived as astute businesswomen. They studied slave prices, attended auctions, and navigated the market with shrewd eyes. Marriage didn't always bind them. Sometimes it freed them. Single and married, these women held economic power. They were slaveholders, their ownership etched into the fabric of their lives. Witnessing sexual abuse didn't soften their hearts, it hardened them. They turned a blind eye, perpetuating the cycle of violence. Maternal slavery, a twisted mirror reflecting their own desires. Enslaved wet nurses became pawns in their game. Vanity and convenience guided their choices. They weaned their own children, leaving enslaved mothers bereft. The toll, the emotional weight of stolen motherhood, remained unspoken. And so, these mistresses interfered in enslaved women's parenting. They supervised pregnancies, dictated births, and played midwives. Benevolent assistants, they called it. But the truth was darker, a uniquely gendered form of maternal violence. It's impossible to truly grasp the depth of anguish that enslaved women endured, their bodies and souls subjected to unspeakable violations. Their fertility wasn't cherished for the miracle of life, but rather eyed as a means to an end. A healthy infant represented not just a life, but a future asset, a piece to be torn from its family's embrace and bartered for profit. As Jones Rogers contends, common threads of womanhood, like the bond of motherhood, didn't inspire these mistresses to challenge the status quo. Instead, these shared experiences became battlegrounds where they reinforced racial divides, wielding their privilege and power like a scepter. On these plantations, some white women didn't just stand by, they were active participants in the sexual torment of male slaves. Thomas Balcerski paints a grim picture of a society where the very availability of enslaved individuals, the twisted use of sex to uphold racial dominance, led to encounters between mistresses and enslaved men, encounters that didn't escape the notice of onlookers. Take Harriet Jacobs' words, who observed how some mistresses mirrored the absolute control that fathers had over female slaves. She recalls one mistress who selected the most subdued slave as her consort, fully aware that her authority over him was unchallenged, her actions hidden from prying eyes. These instances were not the norm, but they peel back the layers on how white women navigated, exploited, and perpetuated the entrenched hierarchies of race, gender, and power. Morgan points out that not all abuse was overtly sexual. Yet, even the everyday was tainted with a perverse undertone in the South. Enslaved individuals, stripped of dignity and often clothing, became unwilling participants in a display that shocked visitors like William Harding, who couldn't fathom the sight of enslaved men, scarcely covered, attending to high society ladies without a hint of their discomfort. Privacy invasions went further, with mistresses subjecting slaves to beatings or demanding intimate services, their bodies a canvas for cruelty. And in the aftermath, silence was bought with threats. Accusations of rape hung over the heads of these men, a sinister tool used by white women to maintain the facade, exploiting societal fears of blackness equated with sexual predation. These harrowing tales reveal a disturbing truth. In a world that denied them sexual autonomy, white women found a perverse form of power through the subjugation and desecration of enslaved bodies. Thank you for engaging with this content. If it moved you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.